The Georgia Secretary of State's office has sent cease and desist orders to the owner of the National Cemetery chain.
The orders demand the owner stop damaging grave sites and proposes one of the biggest fines against the cemetery company. The state's actions are in response to an 11Alive reveal investigation last night by our own Andy Perotti.
Andy, I have not smiled as big in a long, long time. I'm so excited, I don't even have words.
Floyd County's clerk of court reacts to proposed fines against the owner of a Rome cemetery that has caused she and others pain for years.
By gum, it's time. It's time it happened.
How about this one?
This past March, Barbara Pinson showed us broken headstones, sunken graves, and people buried in the wrong plot at Oaknell Memorial Gardens, owned by StoneMor Incorporated. Her own father's headstone was once damaged too.
It's all just ruined now. It's just uncalled for.
Problems she and others have documented on this Facebook page since 2017.
And then you can play it.
About a week after sharing our findings with Georgia's Secretary of State Brad Raffensperger's staff, his office launched an investigation into all 7 StoneMor-owned cemeteries in Georgia.
We can level charges, and we will after we finish up with our investigation. We hear their concerns and we share their concerns.
This week, the state sent these cease and desist orders to the company, proposing $753,000 in fines, one of the largest proposed fines the state has ever levied against a single cemetery owner.
Well, that's a little punch in the pocketbook, I would think. It sounds like our Secretary of State has heard us. Perhaps it's going to get somebody's attention now.
According to the orders, state investigators discovered markers and headstones that are damaged or in a state of disrepair. Several graves were sinking, calling the cemeteries rampant with problems.
I had no hope. I really didn't. I didn't think anything was going to happen.
But something did happen, and it could now cost a national cemetery chain a financial penalty.
Andy, I'm here to say, were it not for Channel 11Alive, we would still be where we started 5 years ago, begging for help.
StoneMor declined to comment on the proposed orders, and it's worth noting that making proposed orders public is somewhat rare. The state typically handles these things behind closed doors in hopes of negotiating a deal and addressing the problem that way. StoneMor has 10 days to schedule a hearing to respond to the violations. If it doesn't, the fines are permanent.
Some important results for those families. You can see more of Andy's investigation right now. Just look for this story on 11alive.com.